we're going to be talking about green finance, DMRV, and carbon market mechanisms on Hedera. And as part of that, we think about these different solutions and tools in the context of the problems that they're solving. We generally don't use tools unless we have a problem. Some things may be fun, but in the case of climate change, we're trying to solve key challenges that are both strategic in terms of the 1.5 and 2 degree goals and pathways, but also tactically, those challenges need to be addressed point by point, data point by data point, community by community, financial flow by financial flow. And we've broken that down into a lack of auditability from a financial system, understanding audit and verification and project data, looking at things like estimates as potentially being part of the problem where we need to have more direct monitoring. And part of the issue is those estimates are based on analog systems because we don't have systems today that enable digital pathways for us to actually understand primary data versus indirect data. And when we have those digital pathways, of course, we can make better decisions based on pricing for data, pricing for those assets. And we can ultimately build markets that we understand the context of an action to a payment back to an outcome. And as part of our view of that, we need to put all these assets, data points, and ultimately, oftentimes tokens on a public ledger. The data needs to be auditable. Financial systems need to be auditable. Information needs to be discoverable. It can't just be data. We have to be able to read it, with our own two eyes and understand what that information is going to look like. And ultimately, where liquidity makes sense, and not every asset needs liquidity. Sometimes it's investment in our communities, but in things like carbon credits, we need to be able to invest and trade to get to net zero outcomes. And so from an HBAR Foundation perspective, we're thinking about this in 5 key goals in terms of bringing the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger. We think making climate finance auditable, digitizing and open sourcing methodologies, scaling validation and verification, discovering a global carbon and climate asset price, and making ESG reporting credible are those key goals. It means we need to improve the systems we have today. We do not need to destroy them. We need to take those systems, evolve them to their next versions, and make sure we use tools like protocols to evolve the platforms that we have today. And we think about this in the type of a market infrastructure. Oftentimes in carbon credits, we have a supply and demand. And it's pretty easy for folks to understand that if I'm going to be an emitter, I need to do something to offset that. They understand that they generally need to buy a carbon credit. There's different companies, corporations, countries who are going to have specific goals, whether they're local to their footprint or national, which is an aggregation of footprints. And of course, this goes down to a project level. You need project level accounting following a specific series of rules or sets of rules that rolls up into national accounting strategies. But in every project, you have actors, you have data that they're producing, and you have different project types or rule sets that they're following tied to a unit of outcome. On Hedera, that ultimately at the lowest level or that technical level means you need an audit log where those actors are reporting information tied to an identifier. That doesn't necessarily need to be an account. That doesn't need to necessarily be tied to the personally identifiable information or a device's ID, but oftentimes it is. And we can selectively disclose that information following those different rule sets to get to a tokenized outcome that can ultimately be traded. Of course, the Guardian, which is kind of our keystone tool, allows you to digitize rule sets that allows those roles to be mapped, actors to plug into those roles, and when data is produced following those series of roles to link to something like a metric ton or a megaliter of water. And those could be emissions, those could be offsets, or it could be a biodiversity unit. It doesn't always have to be a metric ton. And those methodologies, they're built in JSON, they're not built in Solidity, they're not built in complex programming languages. And as evidenced by this great hackathon that Filecoin Green put together, people are building them in 2 to 3 weeks with no experience in this type of programming language, with no experience in this type of methodology background. And they're starting from scratch and able to take the environmental rule sets of today and build them out to be able to issue example credits in the case of our hackathon. But in the real world, we're seeing folks issue credits of being able to be sold for high prices because they have better transparency, better links of data to the attributes that are being derived from them, and better sourcing of those roles and actors who are fulfilling them. So we can show financial transparency going back to farmers, we just heard about land use in the previous panel, going back to different participants in the value chain. So we can not just see financial transparency, but data transparency to that unit of value. And of course, that matters not just to companies who are buying credits or in terms of our accounting, our accounting structures. It matters to auditors to be able to see that information. It matters to the entire market's confidence, right? If we can understand these different relationships, we can have better confidence in our markets. And so the way that we've invested, because we're a grant fund, ultimately, the Sustainable Impact Fund at the HBAR Foundation, we've invested across the different areas in this value chain, across these supply and demand markets. And so we've invested in areas like project funding. You'll see projects here like EverCity, who received a grant. They focus on green bonds, carbon forwards, and even carbon forward attached green bonds, so we can improve the rate of return, but also have financial auditability in that project funding phase. We have the market supply that we showed on the previous slide, those methodologies, those digitized and open source methodologies. We invest in different projects and portfolios of projects so we can have the largest methodology library in the world of those digitized and open source methodologies. And that's the largest today that we're aware of. That all uses the Guardian. That means anyone can take a methodology off the shelf, create a project. And when they create that project, they can compare the rules, whether they're using Verra's rules, gold standards rules, CDM's rules, or different emissions accounting systems to each other line by line, and understand the answers line by line and see the percentage difference and understand the attributes. That's something that we don't think has been done before. We've showed that recently in an example where we compared Verra's VM0017 to VM0042, which is an Afalo methodology to an Afalo methodology, 1-to-1, and we could show the difference. We're now going to go ahead and show that again, Verra to gold standard this coming month, just to give an illustrative example of what could be. And those are the types of things we think about in the market supply. Now that we can compare, can we get to better pricing for specific roles and actors in a methodology, not just methodology to methodology, metric ton to metric ton, but attribute to attribute. Of course, we need better visualization for that. We invest across data management and tooling to be able to better visualize these systems. We invest in new types of market mechanisms. And I think this is really important. New types of market mechanisms that actually understand the attributes. They don't just understand a methodology and a metric ton. We can actually put pricing on financial attributes. Who is getting paid? What percentage are they getting paid out of a carbon project? What percentage are they getting paid out of a biodiversity project? Are they doing payments for ecosystem services, or are they just doing payment to a financier? Those are the types of things we're thinking about in our market mechanisms and putting context on the markets that exist. Of course, that makes it easier for buyers, whether they're buying country by country, emission type by emission type, to be able to better match their impact on the planet. And ultimately, what we want to see is when we have these contextual assets in climate markets, like offsets, like biodiversity assets, and we have contextual liabilities, like emissions, because we can use those same measurement, reporting, and verification systems on emissions or any other type of consumptive activity or extractive activity. We can actually automate all this information from an ESG reporting perspective to say, well, if I want to go and submit a CDP in the future, could I take a token and use it as a data automation mechanism so I don't have to do complex work because I already have gotten it off of reports and sensors that are tied to these assets on this balance sheet, and ultimately we see that as the balance sheet of our planet. And that should be used from a reporting perspective to make life easier for enterprises and companies and make it, a logical business solution that I would use tokens that have audit trails tied to every role and actor to do my reporting. And this is mapped in the ecosystem on Hedera. So what you see here is the entire flow, all the way from forwards or green bonds into measurement, reporting, and verification tied to project developers, projects, VVBs, registries, some with examples of companies in our ecosystem that go through the Guardian to create different accounts on Hedera and wallets where tokens are going to be held, but they're not just token wallets, they're identity wallets as well. One thing I do want to highlight, those identity wallets have credentials built in where you can selectively disclose information that considers privacy of users, which today isn't necessarily considered in the carbon markets. The registries, they post a PDF and say it's incumbent on folks to withhold information to follow GDPR. But if you go look at those PDFs that are in the different registries, I don't know if that's something that is happening today. And that's an opportunity we have as a Web3 marketplace to enable protecting of user identities and privacy in the context of creating these assets. Of course, that can go into liquidity pools if it's a forward. It can go into complex contextual markets like Toll Earth, or running this tool called the ARM, the Automated Regression Market Maker, which I believe is the first open source, fully open source marketplace of its type in the Web3 ecosystem for an AMM for NFTs. Anyone can take it, fork it, or run a managed service of it today. And they could go into other, more asset by asset marketplaces like Dovu. They can go into bridges, they can go into derivatives platforms, synthetics, or even just be bought for ESG reporting, all on Hedera today. And so I want to talk about a couple examples. The And I mentioned Evercity earlier at the start of that flow. So Evercity is a Berlin-based company. Alexi's in the room here today. And Evercity has been building sustainable debt solutions, but actually going back, they were the first company in Web3 to issue a carbon credit in a previous organization on, they issued on Ethereum blockchain in 2017, first carbon credit transaction. And the lessons they learned have brought them into the sustainable debt market, where they're now making it easier to actually issue those credits. And the ease of issuing the credits is because they start with the requirements of the carbon markets. They start with a project idea note going into a project description or design document, so that we can actually issue a forward based on the credibility of the audit trail of when I came up with the idea, understanding the project developers, understanding who the VVB is, following a methodology that they help the project select. And that helps them issue forwards in a way where we can actually not just understand the structuring, the issuance, the monitoring, reporting, but understand the roles and actors involved, how the payment goes back to those different participants, and issues assets that are contextual both in data, but as well as financing. That can be deposited into different financial flows and structures. I'm not going to explain this slide in full detail, but it could be done in a bond or a forward. And that could go into a liquidity pool where investors can actually see this information. They can actually see where their financial flow is going to go to, back to the communities, back to investors, back to consultants. And you can see the steps they're taking to make the project data more transparent in the process. The idea that you can not just have on-chain verification of a project, but you can have on-chain financial verification, data descriptions that you can check yourself for the first time and understand every single role and actor involved. We have Tollum Earth, who I referenced earlier, is building this open source marketplace. If we look at going beyond forwards and sustainable debt, Tollum Earth has created a market called an automated regression market maker. It's a new type of market mechanism that a company named Block Science came up with in partnership with HBAR Foundation and Hedera. And the ARM allows you to price things based on attributes. Now, historically, most carbon markets pricing is based on environmental attributes. And there's a subjective view on things like co-benefits that enable higher or lower pricing. There's also, questions of the competence of that environmental data, which also influences the pricing. What Tollum's able to do is take a smart contract that is powered by a machine learning model to understand the context of the information that machine learning model has and put predictive pricing based on that attribute. And what they've gone ahead and said, and as part of a published piece of work with Block Science, is we're going to start with the predictive model, go into paper trading, then go into back trading, and ultimately enable an automated market where that smart contract can actually transact based on the predicted value of the credit to be able to buy or resell that credit within the market maker to other market makers, other market participants, and ultimately enable buyers to use their service to be able to search based on attributes. So you can query, buy from hundreds of projects, tens of projects, whatever number of projects that meet your attribute-based requirements, meaning your due diligence could rely on Guardian-based assets with those audit trails, that financial information of the financial flows, the data on the environmental information, and make decisions based on queries, based on what the actual market supply is in real time. And that's a pretty cool project for us because we can change how the market works. We can meet the new types of requirements that are coming out of the Paris Agreement based on these types of mechanisms, these new technologies that value different contexts that they operate in. The last one, I'm going to switch over to the emission side and talk about a Fortune 500 company. So we've talked about two companies who are startups in the Web3 space, but I think it's important to think about institutions. The Hedera Governing Council is a group of companies that run the nodes of the Hedera network. So they're generally the leaders in their industry. If you think of Avery Dennison as the world's largest RFID manufacturer, you have companies like Google, DLA Piper, Tata Communications, Standard Bank, FPOS, Shinhan Bank. You go around the world and you see this selection of companies that have decided to be Web3 leaders, Web3 innovators, and participate in the governance and ownership of Hedera for up to a 3-year terms or a 6-year term, if they fulfill both terms consecutively. And these innovators are building in sustainability. They're not necessarily all the companies you first think of when you say ReFi, but I would argue that they may be the biggest companies in sustainability. And Avery Dennison has gone ahead as the world's largest RFID manufacturer, and they're tracking goods on Hedera. And so their digital IDs that they're tracking, and this is part of a feature that's live in production. If you were to go buy Atma Cloud today, or Atma IO, you would be able to connect your products and devices to track digital birth certificates, things like digital product passports, as well as carbon emissions tokens on Hedera. And the idea behind Atma is that every product has a soul. And as part of that soul, not just tracking, but being able to understand your footprint and ultimately being able to buy carbon reduction tokens so that you can actually prove not just where's my product from, what's my product footprint, but can I offset? And I want to kind of let everyone think about this. So we have our emissions tracking platform in this very specific example. And this is not the only one on Hedera. There's quite a few. This is just the one that I think is illustrative of the full opportunity for the context of this conversation. You have folks like Tolem, where you can buy credits. You have folks like Evercity, who are helping issue credits. And you can look at the entire life cycle of this market from sustainable debt through issuance, trading, and ultimately emissions tracking and retirement. Those are all things you can do on Hedera today, all based on open source code with the world's largest library of digital methodologies that you can take off the shelf and use yourself or augment to build new methodologies. And so if you go through this life cycle and you say, I want to show the sources of my emissions, I want to display all my emissions, make them discoverable to all my supply chain stakeholders. And if you think about the context of scope 1, 2, and 3, imagine your scope 3 or scope 2 emissions tokens are referencing scope 1 emissions. I can show every regulator exactly where the source of my upstream and downstream emissions are. I can show the improvements and reductions that I'm making in my supply chain. I can show where I can't reduce in my supply chain. I can go buy reductions tokens or offset tokens on Hedera through contextual markets based on where those emissions are happening. And I can show that I'm actually achieving net zero. And by the way, I can take those assets and automatically report them. And that's really what we want to get to. That's our view on infrastructure. That's how we want to bring the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger. And I'd encourage you to think about that, and feel free to come find us, talk to us. Both myself, Jonathan Rakoff are here today, and many members of our ecosystem. And we'd love to help bring that balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger together with you. Thank you.